Now, so I was at the, first of all, I was into the Thanksgiving ceremony. I was thanking Mansi, Avantika, uh, Tarveen, Astha, without whose logistical support, and my son Siddhant, without whose logistical support, I would not have been able to, operate these apparatus. I'm not techno savvy. Then I was thanking Avantika, my two juniors, Siddhant and Parul, for the content that they have supplied and worked, burned the midnight oil to give me the content. So now, after this Thanksgiving is over, we come back to history. So I was telling, I started by saying how the writs came into existence. The writs came into existence in the year 1774 when the Supreme Court was established in Calcutta, and which was known as Supreme Court, and the power of issuing prerogative writs was conferred. Why these writs were called prerogative writs? These were called prerogative writs because only the Crown had the power to issue these writs. Crown was considered as the ultimate source of justice. So the Crown had the power to issue these writs, and they were called the prerogative writs. Subsequently, the Supreme Courts were created at Calcutta, Bombay, and they also had the power to issue prerogative writs. The current, the Article 227 in its current form came into existence in 78. In 77, there was a massive amendment to the Article 226. The fundamental rights were suspended. The Congress government that was there in power at that time amended the constitution, and all these constitutional rights were suspended, and the Article 226 was virtually given a go by. It was when the next government, that was the Jan Sangh government, came into power in 77. They fulfilled their promise, and 78, the new Article 226 was notified. The article as it exists now is the article which has been in existence since 78. So much so for the history. Now when we come to the brass tacks, let's start from the very basic. Who can file a writ petition? Anybody who is aggrieved can file a writ petition. Well, who is a person aggrieved? A person whose legal right has been infringed, who has suffered a legal injury, who has suffered a decision without complying with the principles of natural justice. He is a personal aggrieved, and he can go to the court and file a writ petition. There being two exceptions to this rule. Three, I may say. One is the writ of habeas corpus, reduce the body of the person, and the other being quo warranto, remove a person unauthorizedly occupying an office. And the third exception which was carved out is in the nature of public interest litigation. So public interest litigation. Now, these are the three which are exceptions to the rule that a person who is himself aggrieved can only approach the court and ask for a writ. Now, against whom a writ lies? Against whom a writ lies? We have, all of us, since all of us are practicing lawyers, we've studied in law colleges, we've studied these chapters which say, well, writ can lie against instrumentalities and authorities apart from government under Article 12. All those authorities which are state within the meaning of Article 12 would be amenable to writ jurisdiction. Now, this concept of amenability to writ jurisdiction has undergone a huge change. In Ajay Hasya, the court said, and Anand Mukti Morcha, the court said, well, The test is that the government has the control, administrative control, financial control, uh, and whether the authority is in the nature of is created by a statute, so and so forth. Later on, this concept started being varied bit by bit, and two judgments which immediately come to my mind are BCCI and the Zee Telefilms. So I think Zee Telefilms came pehle and BCCI versus State of Bihar Cricket Federation came later. In BCCI versus State of BCCI, Zee Telefilms versus BCCI, the court had said that, look, it was a constitution bench which said, look, the BCCI does not have the trappings of a state. It's not a state under Article 12 of the Constitution. And they concluded that they just left it there that BCCI would not be state under Article 12 of the Constitution. This was in Zee Telefilms versus Union of India. But because they had their own reasons to say this. They say that board was not created by any statute. It was just a society registered under the Tamil Nadu Act. There was practically no financial assistance given to the board by the government. The board did not enjoy any monopoly status in the field of cricket. It was not a status conferred, so I beg to differ on this. Though board did not enjoy a monopoly status in the field of cricket, because the subsequent judgment says no, the board does occupy. There is no deep and pervasive control of the government on the board. The control is only regulatory in nature, as applicable to similar bodies. The control is not specifically exercised under any special statute applicable to the board. All functions of the board are not public functions, nor are they closely related to government functions. The board has not been created by transfer of any government undertaking. But in the subsequent judgment, which is the judgment of Board for Control of Cricket in India versus Cricket Association of Bihar, the court took notice of this judgment in Zee Telefilms versus Union of India and came to a conclusion that, look, in that judgment, in Zee Telefilms, the court only considered that the Zee Telefilm, that the board did not have the status of an instrumentality of state. But they said that there are elements which would make board look at, if we look at the board, we'll see that board is performing public duties. And performance of these public duties by the board will bring the board within the four corners, will make the board amenable to writ jurisdiction. What the court says is that the board, may I just read it, that the board selects a team to represent India in international matches. The board makes rules that govern the activities of cricket players, umpires and other persons involved in the activities of cricket. The petitioner nature of state, these are in the nature of state functions, and it is an entity which discharges function which only an instrumentality of state can perform. Therefore, they say that board would be amenable to writ jurisdiction under Article 226. In fact, the court said that if someone associated with the game of cricket can be awarded the highest award, civilian award, that is the Bharat Ratna, that itself reflects on the importance of the game of cricket. And the board which regulates this cricket game in India surely would be amenable to writ jurisdiction under Article 12. So now we have reached a stage where it is not material how the entity has been created, whether it is created by a statute, under a statute, whether it's an instrumentality of state or other authority under Article 12 of the Constitution. What is now relevant is to see whether there is an element of public duty in the performance of there is an element of public duty in the discharge of its functions by the entity. If the entity is performing public functions, then it will be amenable to writ jurisdiction. So things over the years have become quite diluted. The approach over the years, so if you look at the court's approach in the initial years, was little more stringent. The court went by the letter of the law. But now the court is very liberal. What the court sees is whether there is, there is an element of public duty that in the entity against whom the writ is sought. If there is an element of public duty, then the writ is available. For example, I'll give you an example. And this is from a judgment of the Supreme Court. A writ was filed against an unaided private engineering college by its employees. The employees were wanting the same pay structure, same pay scale as had been granted to their similarly placed employees in the government sector. A plea was taken that this is purely a private institution, totally uncontrolled by the government, unaided. Therefore, whether writ would lie against it. The Supreme Court said yes, the writ will lie against it because it is performing a public duty. It's controlling the huge number, the students who study in these private institutions. There's a huge number of private institutions, a huge number of students which come to study in these private institutions. Therefore, they control the lives of so many students. Therefore, they said there is an element of public duty, and the institution was held to be amenable to writ jurisdiction. The other case which comes to mind is of DAV College. Now, DAV is a huge institution. It has schools, colleges all across the country. And it controls all those educational institutions. It controls education in a big way through the medium of these educational institutions. So it has been held to be performing a public duty and therefore amenable to writ under Article 226 of the Constitution. I think so far so good, because this is a vast topic. One can go at detail to great lengths in discussing whether but actually it will depend on the facts of each case, whether a particular entity would be amenable to writ jurisdiction or not. No straitjacket formula can be really carved out, and it will be always dependent upon how the courts perceive the functioning of an authority, of an entity. Whether the court sees the entity performing any public duty, then obviously the writ petition will be entertained. So far as against whom the writ lies. The one thing which I wanted to tell my friends watching this is, there are two things which are from a very practical point of view. You see, the Constitution says that when there is an ex parte order granted against an entity, it needs to be heard and vacated within a certain time. I think it's 15 days, if I'm not mistaken. Now, more often than not, what happens is that all these entities. What I was saying was that I was on the aspect of delay and latches. I'll come to the other aspect in a moment. First, let me deal with delay and latches, because a lot of thoughts come to your mind, they get all jumbled. Okay, I was on this aspect of stay being granted. One of the very liberal judges at one point of time told me, look, we are very liberal in our approach. When this was the time, of course, before we had the system in the Delhi High Court of an advance copy being served, and the state being represented on the other side. They said, whenever there is an ex parte order granted, or an ad interim injunction granted, or any order which is in the nature of an interim order is granted, the party against whom the interim order is granted must rush to the court with expedition. It must tell the court, look, the skies have fallen. I am really prejudiced. I'm suffering. So please vacate the order. Now that puts the court itself under a huge pressure. And instead of, I'm talking about my respondent friends my friends who are more often on the respondent side. So instead of filing a counter affidavit, taking your own time, filing a reply to the application for injunction, taking your own sweet time, I think what is required is to act with expedition and immediately file an application for injunction. The vacation of the injunction. The other aspect is of delay and latches. We all know that the Constitution of India, Article 226, 227, do not have any limitation prescribed. There is no limitation prescribed, and the courts have said that we will go by the limitation prescribed in the Limitation Act. If you would have filed a suit for the same cause of action, what would have been the time period within which you would have filed a suit? And we would take that as the yardstick to determine whether there is a delay or latches on your part. But there is a catch. There is a catch in which you must understand. Supposing there is a parcel of land, the land use is changed, and after land use, it is proposed to auction that parcel of land for a mall to be built, for shops and offices to be sold in that mall. Now, will the person wait for 3 years that, look, now the advertisement has been issued under Section 11 for change of land use, so I will take my sweet time, I have 3 years time to file a writ petition? No, not at all. The moment the advertisement is issued for change of land use, and if you are aggrieved by it, you must approach the court then and there. That's the time to approach the court. Because if you wait till the time the land use is ultimately changed, the auction takes place, the building is constructed, it will be too late. Even if it happens within a period of, say, 1 year, even if it happens within a period of 6 months, you would have missed the bus. The court will not entertain the petition because your writ petition will be barred by delay and latches. So in that sense, though it will depend on the facts of each case, but delay and latches are something which face the lawyers every day, because sometimes people say, no, 3 years, 2 years. It's not 2 years, 3 years. It is only your expedition from the date the cause of action arose and how third party interests have been created in the interagnum. How it affects the third party interests or the rights in the interagram is what has to be seen. So these were two practical aspects on which I made a detour. Now, the other aspect is which we must look at and consider is what about the self-imposed restraints by the court? The Article 226 does not place any fetters on the powers of the court under Article 226 of the Constitution. Read Article 226, whether it has any fetters on the court's power to exercise writ jurisdiction and issue prerogative routes. No, nothing. But then there are self-imposed restraints which the court has imposed upon itself while exercising writ jurisdiction under Article 226. Some of these restraints I can fathom are bar of alternate remedy. So where there is an equally efficacious remedy, available, then of course the courts will not interfere. Where there is a statutory remedy provided which is equally efficacious, or there is another remedy provided which is equally efficacious, the court will not interfere. For example, against an order passed by the DRT, I'm not saying DRAT, I'm saying DRT, a writ will not lie. An appeal would lie to DRAT. Or against an order passed by the adjudicating authority under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, the petition would lie to the board. Then what? Of course, it has to go there. The writ has to go there. The petition has to go there. The appeal has to go there. But supposing there is no presiding officer, as there was none in PMLA till recently. Till recently, there was only one officer in PMLA who was adjudicating, and he was also coming on alternate days. So the writs were filed and were entertained by the court. Were filed and the court said, we brought it to the notice of the court that there is no one to hear our grievance. There is an order that we are suffering and we need an interim injunction right now. The court did entertain because there is a remedy available. There is a statutory remedy available. The statute provides for that remedy. But the remedy ceases to be equally efficacious because there is nobody to remedy the situation at that stage. Therefore, the remedy is not equally efficacious at that stage. So, the writ will lie. So, there is a bar for alternate remedy. Again, this bar is a self-imposed bar which the courts have created on themselves. It is not to be found in Article 226 of the Constitution. Some other bars of this nature are disputed questions of fact. With the writ petition raises a disputed question of fact, the court will not entertain a writ petition. This position has been explained subsequently in Joshi's judgment, Joshi Technologies, and I'll deal with that judgment. When there are disputed questions of fact, where there are monetary claims involved, where the writ is filed against investigation, police investigation, at the stage of police investigation. And there's one more which I seem to be forgetting. Let me just check my papers and back to you. I have a note here. Yes. So, So all these restraints these are at the end of the day self-imposed restraints. These are not to be found in writ jurisdiction. They are not to be found in writ jurisdiction under the Constitution, and they are self-imposed restraints only. It becomes a matter of fact in every case. You have to convince the court that though there is this bar, I am still entitled to a writ, because the factual matrix is such that the writ petition, if the court does not come to my rescue, then I have no way to go. And there's something else which I must tell you. The writ petition is available not only against, is available against a perceived threat. So if there is a threat of demolition, writ petition is maintainable. People do file writ petitions when there is a threat of demolition. But when you don't have to wait when the threat has actually been carried out, or when the government wants to do something which is illegal. Supposing government passes an order saying that close your establishment for XYZ reason. Close your. I'm not talking about the Epidemic Act or the Disaster Management Act, which are being invoked now. In a general situation, if the government says, passes an order that with effect from such and such date, your premises shall stand sealed. You don't have to wait for actual sealing. You will come to court. There are questions, I will come to these questions later. So you don't have to wait till the threat is actually executed. You have to come to the court, rush to the court when there is a threat perception in itself. So that is very important. Then, while I was on this topic of self-imposed restraints, traditionally it was the view that where there are monetary claims, the writ petition will not lie. Where there are disputed questions of fact, the writ petition will not lie. But all these concepts have now been diluted, to a great extent. Especially if you read this judgment as of Joshi Technologies Limited, International versus Union of India, which is a judgment of 2005, and two very celebrated judges, Justice Sikri and Justice Nariman. Both of them say that there is no strict rule that writ petition will not lie when there are disputed questions of fact, or monetary claims are raised, or where there are contractual matters, or in contractual matters. They said no, there's no hard and fast rule. The matter has to be examined by the High Court in its discretion. The High Court will have to see if there is if public interest, larger public interest requires it to interfere, then the court must interfere, even where there are monetary claims, where there are contractual disputes, where there are disputed questions of fact. But the matter has been left to the sound discretion of the court, which obviously will not be arbitrary discretion, has to be exercised on sound reasoning. So all these concepts have now been diluted to a large extent. So all these self-restraints which have been imposed by the court on its own powers under Article 226 remain. However, they have been diluted, and you will, as a lawyer, have to convince the court that, look, there are disputed questions of fact arising in my writ petition. I know. But these are disputed questions which can be decided simply on the basis of affidavit being called from both the parties. These do not require detailed evidence being recorded. These do not require any detailed evidence being recorded, and they can be an affidavit can be asked from both the parties to give their records, submit their records, and the court can decide only on the basis of affidavits. In contractual matters also, you can say that contractual matters, actually I'll deal a little later. The most surprising part is that this judgment says that monetary claims can be entertained in writ jurisdiction, uh, which is a landmark shift from the earlier times and earlier judgments, which says that writ jurisdiction cannot be converted into a suit for recovery of money. But having analyzed the case law, they said that even monetary claims can be entertained in writ jurisdiction. However, the court will be loath to do this. The court will be loath to do this, and the court will not be very. Court will have to examine in detail whether the circumstances are such that it is the larger public interest which requires the court to interfere. Not in the instance of an individual, not in the instance of an individual who says, well, the authority owes me 100 rupees, so a lakh of rupees or a crore of rupees. So instead of filing a suit, files a writ petition. No, in that case, there's no public interest involved. It's a private dispute between that individual and the government entity, even if it's a government entity. Forget about a private entity. Even if it's a government entity, it's a dispute between an individual, a private entity and another entity which is a government entity. There, instead of filing a suit, you can't file a writ petition and claim a money decree. The other, now it brings us to the other aspect, which is writ petition in contractual matters. Now, insofar as the contractual matters are concerned, the law has undergone a major shift. Sorry. The law has undergone a major shift. There are two stages. Let's take these as two different stages. One is the stage of entering into the contract. The government normally enters into contracts by floating tenders, auction, or floating short-term inquiries. So these are situations where the government resorts to tendering. Now the law is that at the stage when the government is entering into a contract, then the government or the instrumentality of state or the authority is only performing an executive function. It's performing an executive function. Therefore, the scope of interference of the court will be there. I'm only saying will be there, but it is subject to certain restraints. So the court will interfere at that stage. The court will interfere if, supposing the tender document is not being made available to a certain party, or some party is trying to bid online bidding, and it says, well, my bid is not being accepted by the system. Or somebody says, well, I did bid in the online portal, but my bid was never accepted. The portal was closed much before the closing time. So these, somebody says that, look, the tender document has been created to suit only one party, because this concept is wholly alien to Indian conditions, and there is only this party who could have bid for this tender and be successful. So where there is arbitrariness writ large in the act of the authority, arbitrariness, favoritism. Sorry? Hello? Am I audible?
So you're not audible again.
Okay, I was muted. Then I'm on.
Morning.
Okay. So where did I leave? Okay, so I was saying that when the tender document is tailor-made to suit some particular party, and the arbitrariness is writ large in the tender document, favoritism is writ large, the courts can interfere. But then there is another rider to this. The court said that look, in the modern day, the state enters into contractual fui to fulfill its obligations. We can understand that the state must act fairly even in contractual matters and not discriminate. But then some play in the joints is required. Some play in the joints is required. We are not experts to see whether the tender document has the terms and conditions, the correctness of the terms and conditions of a tender document. We are not going to look at it. As long as we find, so they say that we are not going to be looking at the soundness of the decision. Whether the decision taken is sound or not, whether the party, who was not L1 has been selected or not, we are not going to be looking at soundness of the decision. What we are going to be looking at is whether the decision taken is taken on has a rational basis. If there is a rational basis for that decision, the court will not interfere. So it's the Wensbury principle. Wensbury principle has been in existence. The Wensbury principle has been, I think there is a message that please don't unmute your mic till the session is on, because if there is unmuting of the mic, then it will obviously interfere in the discussion. So what I was saying was that at this stage of entering into the contract, there should be no favoritism, no arbitrariness, and these are the things which the court can look at at this stage of entering into the contract. What the court will do is the court will go by the Wensbury principle. The court will not look at the decision in itself, whether the decision is correct, wrong. The court will look at the decision-making process, whether the decision-making process is vitiated by any of these factors, such as favoritism, arbitrariness, so on and so forth. If the decision-making process in itself is vitiated, then the court will interfere. But if the decision-making process is not vitiated, then even at the stage of entering into the contract, that is at the stage of examining a tender document, the court will not interfere. The examining the tender document or examining the award of the tender before the contract is concluded, because after the tender is awarded only, so first will be the stage of technical bid, then will be the stage of financial bid, then will be the stage of entering into the contract. So if somebody is ousted at the stage of technical evaluation, the courts have been very loath to interfere. They say we are not experts. We are not going to be converting ourselves as an appellate body over the wisdom of the authority which has floated the tender. It's the authority which knows what is right, what is wrong, what it requires from the party bidding. We are not going to be putting our judgment into it, or we are not going to be enforcing our views on the authority with regard to this. So at the stage of entering the contract, at the stage of entering the threshold, yes, the court can interfere. I would say that the interference that you can expect from court, that you can as a litigator expect from court is the maximum at the stage when the contract is, when the tender is floated, when the tender is being awarded. That's the maximum that you can expect. Once the tender is awarded, and a contract may or may not, it takes time from the point of awarding of the tender till the contract is finally concluded. Once the tender is awarded, it becomes very difficult. Very difficult. Though even at that stage, when the scrutiny of the tender documents is taking place, and the tender documents are being scanned, being looked at by the tendering authority, the plea of Wensbury can be raised. You can say that the decision-making process by which I have been ousted from technical evaluation is wholly flawed. A case in mind comes, is something which I did, and now since a quietus has been put to that case, I can share with you the case. It was a case for a selection of chartered accountants for a particular organization. We were L2. The L1 who was selected, the tender document required that L1 to submit certain documents. A certificate of performance from people from any organization, 2 government organizations, where it would have performed similar tasks within the last 2 years of certain value. It never did. It's applied the certificate only from one organization. It never did. We went to the court, they said that the process is wholly vitiated. We had a good case. We were on the Wensbury principle. We said that, look, we are invoking the Wensbury principle. The court must look at whether the decision-making process is flawed or not. We are not saying that the decision is flawed. We are not going right up to the decision. We are saying that the decision-making process itself is flawed. The party was supposed to give 2 certificates, it's given 1. Unfortunately, we lost. We lost for the simple reason that the authority which had floated the tender, there was a certificate which had come from the other authority also, but which was totally ambiguous, which did not deal with the issue in hand. So there were 2 certificates given, nevertheless. One was clear and one was ambiguous. The authority, the tendering authority went to that authority and said, give me a clarification. That authority gave a clarification, and that second certificate, so there were 2 certificates required, if I am clear. 2 certificates required, one was clear, there was no difficulty. The other certificate did not have the ingredients that were required for that certificate to be of some consequence. But after the tender had been floated, and after we had filed the writ petition, that authority went to the other authority which had issued the certificate, sought a clarification, and on the basis of that clarification said, well, this entity, which was L1, qualifies. And we lost. I don't want to sound critical, but I think our invocation of the Wensbury principle in that matter was correct. The authority, which was tendering authority, had to follow the decision-making process of the authority in selecting at the stage of technical bid was wrong. Nevertheless, that's one case. Let's move forward. So I said, now there are exceptions to this rule. So the other question which one is asked a lot of times whether a writ lies lies when there is an arbitration clause in an agreement. Yes, a writ lies. Please see the judgment of Supreme Court in Tatia Constructions. I think it's Tatia Constructions only, which says even if there is an arbitration clause, the writ jurisdiction is not as to. But then the parameters would be the same as for a suit. Whether there is, whether there is arbitrariness, whether there is, public element involved in these contract, only then, of course, the arbitration, the writ petition will lie. Suits and contract and arbitrations are on the same pedestal. So the areas where a suit will be, where a writ petition will be permitted, and there being a remedy of suit available, would be the same where, despite the availability of arbitration, the writ petition available. Now the other thing is, which you have to look at, is supposing I enter into a contract, and let's take the present scenario. The government says, well, we need 10,000 testing kits. The Ministry of Health issues a notification that we need 10,000 testing kits. Please make an offer. I make an offer, I am selected, and an order is placed on me by the Ministry of Health for 10,000 kits. Subsequently, the Ministry of Home Affairs intervenes and it says, no, only parties up to this much turnover will be qualified to supply kits of this value, which are above this turnover will be entitled to supply kits of this value. And this was never a condition when I entered into a contract, but this is a policy decision which is taken, and which varies my contractual obligations, tends to vary my contractual obligations. I can definitely go and writ and say that you have changed your policy now. Your policy was not in existence when I entered into the contract, and now taking refuge of a policy which has now come into existence, you can't change the terms and obligations of my contract. So that is something important, that where there is policy, when the matters of policy interfere in performance of contractual obligations, or it would definitely lie. Because there the public element creeps in. It's a public element which creeps in the contracts. I think I have covered most of the things. Just one thing, last thing. We all have been writing writ petition under Article 226 and 227 of the Constitution. Well, it is perfectly, according to me, it's perfectly valid and justified, because it is perfectly valid. Okay, I'm given this question, Varun Talwar's question. Alternative remedy was available, but due to lapse of time, such remedy was not availed. Would the writ be hit by the principles of delay and laches? Yes, Varun, it would definitely be hit by the principles of delay and laches. So yes, Varun, it will definitely be hit by the principles of delay and laches. I don't know whether I'm left with. Then there is a question by Dilsheen, whether registered RWAs also perform public duty. No, Dilsheen, there is no public duty being performed by registered RWAs. That is my view, that they don't perform any public duty, and a writ will not lie against a RWA. Sorry, I took these questions because I was just given by my son the phone to answer these questions. I'm sorry. So coming back to what I was saying, it is perfectly valid. I don't see why should there be any objection to 226, 227 being written by us together in our petitions. We write writ petition under Article 226 and 227 of the Constitution. But then there are courts which do not take it very nicely. They say, don't you know whether you are filing a writ under 226 or 227? You should specify whether you are filing under 226 or 227. Therefore, let's do it. Let's be sure whether we are filing it under 226 or 227. One thing, just remember, 226 is an original proceeding. Other than writ of certiorari, which I will deal with. 226 is an original proceeding. But 227 is appellate, revisional, whatever you may say. 227 is not original, because when court exercises its powers under 227, it has already an order passed by the tribunal or the court below. So it is looking at that order of the court and the tribunal below and adjudicating on that. The other thing which is a major difference between 226 and 227 is that in 226, while the court exercises writ of certiorari, grants writ of certiorari, the court can say, well, court can, no, I'm sorry to have used that expression, in exercising writ jurisdiction and writ of court can only quash the order. It can set aside the order in its entirety. Whereas under 227, the court can actually interfere with the order. The court can correct the order, modify the order. So that is one major difference between 226 and 227. But I must tell you all that all these technicalities of 226 and 227 are getting obliterated now, are just getting obliterated. They are no more relevant. They are no more relevant. So don't get too bogged down by this, and just try. Even if you use 226, 227, I don't think you made a mistake. The other aspect of the difference between 226 and 227 is that whereas 227 is exercised, 226 can be exercised by the court suo motu, without being moved by anybody else. 227, which is supervisory jurisdiction, this court exercises supervisory jurisdiction of the tribunals. The High Court exercises supervisory jurisdiction over the courts and tribunals below. In that case, some agreed party will have to approach the court, agreed by the order of the tribunal or the court below. The court cannot suo motu take to it. That's the power vesting in the Supreme Court, where it can withdraw a writ petition or withdraw any proceeding pending before it, before the High Court. But in writ jurisdiction, there's been cases where, if I remember correctly, in Nirmata Sangh, Wazirpur Bartan Nirmata Sangh, the division bench of the High Court did pass an order that no court subordinate to this court will interfere any matter pertaining to the subject matter. This was Wazirpur Bartan Nirmata Sangh was a case where all these premises were being sealed in Delhi. There was massive sealing going on in Delhi. So the court did not want, the courts, subordinate courts, to pass injunction orders. If I am not mistaken, it was Wazirpur Bartan Nirmata Sangh. In that case, the court said no court subordinate to the Delhi High Court will pass any order, and it called to itself all the petitions, all the suits, every petition which was pending in any court in Delhi. So far, insofar as the distinction between Article 226 and 227 is concerned, there is just one thing which is on the practical side. I think I have touched most of the subjects or the topics. The writ jurisdiction is such a such a wide and such a vast topic that we can have 1 hour sessions like this, innumerable 1 hour sessions like this, and one can go on and one would not end. In the 1 hour session that one thought of touching on everything, I think this is all that I could touch upon. There is one thing which I want to share with my friends, and that is, you see, when we file an application in a writ, say for stay, or say for exemption from filing certified copies, we land up invariably saying application under section 151 or application under 39 1 and 2 read with section 151. My friends, this is actually wrong. This is actually wrong. You are invoking, by filing a writ, when you're filing a writ, you are invoking a constitutional remedy. How do you bring in a statutory remedy? Or how do you bring in a statute in a constitutional remedy? So it is wrong. Your application must read like this. Every application, I'm saying, every application in every writ, application under Article 226 of the Constitution, on the analogy of Order 39, Rule 1 and 2, read with Section 151 of the Code of Civil Procedure for so and so. Or you can have, you can say, application on the analogy of application under Article 226 of the Constitution, because application has to be under Article 226 of the Constitution, on the analogy of Section 151 of the Constitution, or application under Article 226 of the Constitution on the analogy of Order 26 Rule 9, where you want some commissioner to be appointed, 26 to 9 of the Constitution for appointment of a local commissioner to visit some site. Okay, now let me take a few questions. I'll be able to take only a few questions. I won't be able to take all the questions, but let me see, there are quite a few. Okay.
Sir, I can do one thing. I can read these questions for you, and then you can start replying.
Okay, Ansi, are there only 4?
I can see only 4 as of now, sir.
Okay, so I will start replying.
Okay, so the first question is from Ms. Tanupriya Gupta. She says, sir, can a litigant file a writ against the DRT order if he is not in a position to deposit the prerequisite court fees while approaching DR80?
Yeah. Now, Anupriya, you said, right? Tanupriya. Now, Tanupriya, there was a time when we all did this. We used to go to the High Court that, look, I don't have money to pay, to pre-deposit. So, let there be an order to the DRAT to entertain my appeal. Unfortunately, now, with, I don't remember the citation, the latest judgment of the Supreme Court and the evolution of law, I'm afraid it is not possible. It is not possible. You have to make a pre-deposit before you file an appeal. So no writ will lie for exemption from making the pre-deposit.
Can we go on to the next question?
Yes.
So the next question is from Mr. Harshit Agarwal.
Yes.
He asks, sir, when the tenure has been awarded to one of the bidders, can one of the unsuccessful bidder approach the court to give a better bid and seek inter se venue?
No, Harshit, that can't be done. That can't be done. Very simple. The response of the court will be, were you sleeping? Now you've seen the entire tendering process. Now you know what is the lowest bid. Now you know what is the lowest bid. Now you want to come and make a bid lower than the lowest tenderer. No, I'm afraid it's not permissible. Won't be permissible. Next. Next, please.
Okay. Sir, the next question is, good evening, sir. To my limited knowledge, Article 227 is about jurisdiction of High Court over courts subordinate to it, that is supervisory
That's
jurisdiction,
right.
as you rightly said. Therefore, the question that comes to my mind is, will tribunals be considered to be a court?
No, the courts, the tribunals are not. They have what they call as trappings of a court. Trappings of a court, but they are not courts. They are not courts. Okay, they are not courts. They have trappings of a court. Okay, now next, please.
The next question is, a writ petition will a writ petition lie against any religious or a charitable institution?
Against any religious, no, it won't lie. So you are asking whether a writ petition would lie against Tirupati Tirumala Devasthanam or Sai Baba Trust? No, a writ will not lie. They are not performing any public duty. They control huge amount of funds. That is all right. They control huge amount of funds which they are using for larger public good. But that does not in itself bring in the public duty element. I have not seen any writ petition being filed against the Tirupati Tirumala Devasthanam or the Sai Baba Trust. But I don't know whether the situation will be same against the Mata Vaishno Devi Trust, because Mata Vaishno Devi Trust is controlled by the government. It's totally controlled by the government. There are trustees which have been taken from elsewhere. I will have to examine this, to be very frank. Insofar as, so you'll have to see factually. As I've said, Tirupati Tirumala Devasthanam and the Sai Baba Trust, they are not going to be amenable to writ jurisdiction. But yeah, one has to see whether Mata Vaishno Devi Trust would fall within that category. I don't know. One has to look at the composition, control, everything. One has to examine that. Next, please.
Sir, the next question is from Mr. Arjun Taneja.
Yeah.
Any of the DAV's school, not the whole DAV, but one of its school where the principal is doubted to be not following the salary norms as devised by the government, and even it is doubted that some funds collected from students or funds from the trust are being siphoned off and not utilized for betterment of school. Can one of the teacher or any student file a writ against that particular school?
Yes, Arjun, the question in itself has the answer. So you will, the student or the teacher can file the writ, but other than the school, they have to make the society, that's the DAV society or the DAV trust, I think, also as a party. So the writ will lie. The writ will lie.
Okay. Sir, next question is from Astha Jain.
Yeah.
Sir, article.
There will be a high court for each state. Which high court will have the power to issue writs to government bodies which were seated outside their jurisdiction? Yes. Astha, I have not understood the question. Can you come again, please?
Astha will have to elaborate the question here.
So Astha, okay, what I understand is, Astha, okay, I'll answer this to the extent that I have understood. See, if there is cause of action has arisen within the territory of Delhi High Court, I'm going to give you an example. Within the territories, within the Delhi High Court exercises jurisdiction, then irrespective of the fact that the writ will lie is being issued against the government of Bihar, will not be a bar. The court can issue a writ against the government of Bihar, Meghalaya, whatever government, if the cause of action has arisen within the territory of Delhi. Supposing, I'll give you an example. We have the office of the resident commissioner of all the states in Delhi. We have the office of the resident commissioner of the state of Bihar. You name the state and you have the office of the resident commissioner. Supposing somebody who is agreed by an order which is passed by the resident commissioner approaches the Delhi High Court and says, look, the resident commissioner for the state of Bihar has passed an order against me. You must tell the state of Bihar, the relief is against the state of Bihar, because I am an employee of the state of Bihar. I am not the employee of the resident commissioner. The writ will lie against the state of Bihar. The seat of the Delhi High Court is Delhi. The cause of action has arisen within Delhi, though the seat of the government is somewhere else. So the writ will lie. Yes. Asta, if I have not answered your question, you are free to call me up and ask me.
Okay, so let's go on the next question then. Alternative remedy, rule of discretion, not rule of jurisdiction. Is it right to say so?
Come again, please. I didn't follow. Alternate remedy.
Alternative remedy, rule of discretion, not rule of jurisdiction. Is
Yes.
it right to say
Absolutely. 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 It's a see, if you read Article 226, where are these bars? Where are these fetters? Alternate remedy, contractual disputes, money claims, disputed questions of fact. They are nowhere there. They are prerogative writs. We've inherited the prerogative writs from the times immemorial. The Constitution, the way our Constitution has worded the writ jurisdiction is in the widest amplitude. You know what I feel? I must tell you. I feel that there is one power which is the power of God above, and then there is this power of the High Court under Article 226. That is the next power. Article 32 is nowhere near Article 226. Article 32 is only fundamental rights. Article 226 is any legal right, to enforce any legal right. So, yes, you're right. So have I answered? No, there is another part to this question, that there is no bar on High Court for entertaining the writ petition even if alternative remedy is available. Yes, there is no bar. No bar. But I have said that these are self-imposed restraints. You will have to tell the court that why aren't you going to the alternative forum, the statutory forum. Somebody had asked earlier, Tanisha had asked the question earlier. With Tanupriya had asked the question. Now what will happen, instead of going to the DRAT where there is deposit required, can somebody say, no, there is an alternate remedy available, but because I have to pay the pre-deposit, I will not go to DRAT, but I will file a writ straight against the order of the DRAT. It's not possible. It will not be possible. Yes. Next, please.
Sir, there are many questions for you now. So, can I just share your email ID with them, and then probably you can keep answering them
Yes.
at your convenience?
Yes, we can do that.
Okay. So, I'm sharing the email ID then. So then everyone can kind of...
Or it's better for them to call me up. I don't want to. I'm not.
Share the number as well?
Please do that. So they can call me up. There are other, Mansi, there are other questions which have come on Facebook. So what do I do? There are a lot of questions which have come on Facebook. So.
Sir, I think there also you can share your email ID, and then probably you can.
Okay, email address and email ID and the phone number can be shared. So if someone has really a problem, see this.
Yeah, shared your email ID and the number on chat, so now people can approach you.
That's right. Thank you, everyone. I hope.
Thank you so much for such a nice, informative session.
Thank you so
Thank you
much,
all for
everyone.
joining. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. I hope I was of some use. Thank you all. Bye. Thank you. Thanks. Bye. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Sir.